Every mining company on Earth looked at this mountain and walked away. The air is just too thin. The storms, well, they never stop. The road will kill you before you reach the top. China showed up anyway, with $7 billion and a plan that nobody believed would work. 10 years later, the same countries that laughed are now scrambling to catch up. This is the story of the mine that changed everything. Act 1. The Mountain That Breaks Men. There is a place in the Peruvian Andes where the earth holds a secret worth nearly $100 billion. You can't see it from the road, if you can even call it a road. You can barely breathe at this altitude. The cold cuts through every layer you're wearing. And the mountain itself seems determined to bury anyone who dares to try. This is Las Bambas. At over 4,000 meters above sea level, this copper deposit sits in one of the harshest, most unforgiving environments on the planet. The air here contains only 60% of the oxygen you'd breathe at sea level. Workers moving equipment, operating machinery, doing anything physical at all. They're fighting their own bodies every single hour of every shift. Altitude sickness at this height isn't just discomfort, it can kill. Fluid fills the lungs, the brain swells. A worker who seems fine at breakfast can be in a medical emergency by noon, and the nearest hospital is hours away down a road that, in bad weather, might not be passable at all. And the weather here is almost always bad. Snowstorms hit Las Bambas more than 200 days a year. Not occasional storms, 200 days. Temperatures regularly plunge to minus 10 degrees Celsius. Equipment freezes solid, pipes crack, lubricants thicken until motors simply seize. One early exploration team was hit by a 2-week blizzard so severe they had no choice but to abandon their entire camp and retreat. But the weather isn't even the hardest part. Getting equipment to Las Bambas in the first place is where most companies broke down, sometimes literally. For decades, the only access to the mine was a single-lane dirt road carved into the side of Andean cliffs. Narrow, unstable, coated in ice and gravel, and terrifyingly exposed. To bring any large piece of machinery to the site, companies had to completely disassemble it, break it down to its smallest components, haul each piece up separately, and rebuild it on site. The cost of transporting equipment to Las Bambas ran at least 3 times higher than any normal mine. In 2013, Swiss mining giant Glencore tried to move a large industrial crusher up that cliff road. Somewhere on the most exposed section, the load shifted. The crusher went over the edge. $50 million. Gone. In a single accident. Before a single ton of copper had ever been mined. Then add the environmental challenge, possibly the most demanding regulatory environment in South American mining. Las Bambas sits inside a protected watershed feeding the upper Amazon River. Local law requires that copper ions in mining wastewater be kept below 0.1 milligrams per liter. That is 150 times stricter than standard drinking water regulations. In 2009, a Canadian company tried to operate here. The environmental standards were breached. The ecosystem was damaged. The Peruvian government fined them $20 million, shut them down, and sent them home. After that, the global mining industry reached a quiet consensus. Las Bambas is too dangerous, too expensive, too regulated, too remote, too everything. One mining executive reportedly called it a thorny rose you admire from a distance and never, ever touch. And for years, nobody touched it. The turn, the decision that shocked the world. Then in 2014, China did something that stunned the entire global mining establishment. China Minmetals Corporation, backed by a government-organized syndicated loan, purchased Las Bambas for $7 billion. It was the single largest cross-border mining investment ever financed by Chinese banks. A record-breaking bet on the mine that the whole world had already written off. The reaction was almost universal. What are they thinking? Western analysts wrote dismissive articles. Mining executives quietly shook their heads. The general consensus was that China had just made a spectacularly expensive mistake, that this $7 billion investment would be swallowed by the same mountain that had defeated everyone else. So why did China do it? Because China was facing a quiet crisis that most of the world hadn't fully noticed yet. China is the world's largest consumer of copper by an enormous margin. Its manufacturing sector devours the metal at a rate that has no parallel anywhere on Earth. The country consumes nearly as much copper annually as the entire European Union combined. But here's the vulnerability that keeps Chinese industrial planners awake at night. Despite being the world's second-largest economy, China controls only 3.9% of global copper reserves. China is consuming a resource it doesn't have enough of at home, and it was buying most of what it needed from just two countries, Chile and Peru, with no real control over the supply, the price, or the politics. The danger of that dependency became horribly clear in 2014, the same year as the Las Bambas purchase, when workers at Chile's state copper company went on strike. The disruption was brief, but copper prices in China spiked by 5% in a single day. One strike, one day, 5%. For Chinese strategists, that number wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a warning. It meant that a labor dispute in a foreign country, thousands of kilometers away, in a place where China had zero leverage, could directly spike the cost of manufacturing across an entire national economy. And the future was only going to make this worse. China's electric vehicle industry was surging toward 5 million units of annual production. An electric vehicle uses approximately 4 times as much copper as a conventional gasoline-powered car. In its motors, its battery systems, its charging infrastructure. The country's solar panel and wind turbine ambitions were equally copper-hungry. The energy transition that China had committed to leading, the one that would define its industrial future, ran entirely on a metal that China didn't control enough of. Las Bambas, with its 10 million tons of proven copper reserves, wasn't just a mining investment. It was a strategic lifeline. Act 2. How China Conquered the Unconquerable. When Chinese engineers arrived at Las Bambas, the mountain wasted no time reminding them why everyone else had left. 3 consecutive months of sandstorms began the moment operations started. Workers wore gas masks just to conduct initial surveys. Tents couldn't be erected. Equipment couldn't be safely deployed. They were essentially working blind in a storm that didn't stop for 90 days. Then came the landslides. A sudden downpour triggered a major collapse that destroyed a newly built temporary access road. More than 30 workers were stranded up the mountain, completely cut off. Emergency helicopters had to be organized to airlift supplies to keep them alive. The mine's central tunnel, the main corridor for ore transportation, had to be completely redesigned and rebuilt 3 separate times as geological surveys revealed unexpected shifts in the surrounding rock structure. Each reconstruction cost hundreds of millions of yuan. Each one added months to a timeline that was already under enormous pressure. Conventional mining equipment, designed and tested at sea level, behaved unpredictably in the thin air and extreme cold. Chinese engineers couldn't just order off-the-shelf machinery and expect it to function. They had to work with domestic research institutions to commission entirely new equipment, hardware specifically engineered for high altitude, extreme cold, intense ultraviolet radiation, and the constant seismic activity of the active Andean fault system. Frequent earthquakes in the region meant that infrastructure decisions had to be constantly revisited. A structure that was sound after one survey might need reinforcement or complete reconstruction after the next tremor. The obstacles seemed endless, and yet, the Chinese teams kept moving. The transportation problem was tackled using drone-based terrain mapping to plan a genuine 4-lane road through the mountain passes. Not a patched dirt track, but a proper engineered highway carved into the Andean cliffs. This single infrastructure investment fundamentally changed the economics of everything that followed. Worker safety was addressed with technology that had never been deployed in a mining environment before. Every worker at Las Bambas received a smart helmet continuously monitoring their heart rate and blood oxygen levels. At 4,000 meters, the early warning signs of hypoxic distress are often invisible to the human eye, but not to a biometric sensor. Workers in danger could be identified and evacuated before emergencies developed. And then came the most transformative decision of all. China invested $100 million in a remote operations center in Lima, Peru's capital, hundreds of kilometers from the mine, connected to Las Bambas via a high-speed 5G network. From this facility, Chinese engineers could control excavators, monitor ore processing equipment, manage blasting operations, and oversee virtually every aspect of the mine's function without setting foot on the mountain. 80% of Las Bambas operations were automated and remotely managed. The Hell mine had become a smart mine. The proof came in 2023 when a sudden landslide threatened the site. The automated monitoring system detected the instability, analyzed the risk, and issued an evacuation order. Every single worker was clear of the danger zone within 10 minutes. The mountain that had once trapped workers and required emergency helicopter rescues was now being managed by a system that could predict its own disasters. In 2021, Las Bambas went silent, not from a storm or an earthquake, but from something, well, harder to engineer your way around: people. Local communities surrounding the mine organized blockades of the access road. Operations were suspended for 50 days. Global copper prices climbed as markets registered the supply disruption. The communities had legitimate concerns rooted in the history of mining in their region, in the experience of the Canadian company that had damaged their watershed, in fears amplified by years of reports questioning whether large-scale extraction could coexist with the ecosystems and livelihoods they depended on. China's response was not what many expected. There were no legal threats, no political pressure, no public confrontation. Instead, Chinese operators came to the table. They listened to community leaders. They asked what people actually needed, not what a corporate social responsibility checklist said they should provide, but what would genuinely improve life for the people living in the shadow of the mine. And then they delivered. 80 million yuan was invested in the construction of the Kutukte Bridge, a piece of infrastructure that cut commuting times for surrounding villages by 4 full hours. Not mining infrastructure, community infrastructure. Built because people needed it. Community dividend payments were increased. 34 local organizations were funded to jointly develop a reforestation project covering 368 hectares. 600,000 juvenile trout were released into 7 surrounding waterways, directly addressing community concerns about the impact on local fisheries. A program called the Heart of Las Bambas was established, regular community forums and open days where residents could ask questions, raise concerns, and track whether what was promised was actually being delivered. The conversation changed. Today, 60% of young people in the communities around Las Bambas say they are willing to work at the mine. They are earning 3 times the local average wage. Per capita GDP in the Apurimac region has risen from $1,300 in 2014 to $4,000 in 2023. A region that was once defined by poverty and isolation has been transformed, not by charity, but by inclusion in the economic story of its own resources. 10 years after the acquisition that the world mocked, the numbers tell a story that is almost impossible to argue with. At current copper prices of approximately $10,000 per metric ton, the 2.7 million tons already mined from Las Bambas represent a realized value of $27 billion. The original investment was $7 billion, and the mine isn't close to finished. Remaining recoverable reserves exceed 10 million tons, a total value approaching $100 billion still in the ground. Every year, 400,000 tons of copper concentrate leave the Peruvian port of Matarani. 23 days later, those ships dock at Nanjing. From there, The copper moves to Chinese smelters and becomes the motors in electric vehicles, the cables in solar installations, the wiring in high-speed rail. Las Bambas copper is literally powering the energy transition. For Peru, the mine has paid over $1.7 billion in taxes, around 5% of the country's entire annual fiscal revenue. China invested a further $120 million upgrading the port of Matarani, increasing copper export capacity by 50%. A $200 million railway renovation has cut transportation costs by 80%. The Western companies that walked away from Las Bambas left all of this on the table. Here is what this story is really about. It's not just about copper. It's not even just about China. It's about the difference between thinking in quarters and thinking in decades, between calculating the cost of a difficult thing and calculating the cost of never doing it at all. Every major mining company on Earth assessed Las Bambas and reached the same rational conclusion: too hard, too risky, too expensive. Walk away. China looked at the same mountain, the same frozen roads, the same brutal numbers, and asked a different question. What happens to us if we don't? The answer to that question was worth $7 billion. And it has since returned nearly 4 times that in extracted copper alone, with $100 billion still waiting underground. The countries that laughed in 2014 are now urgently building their own critical mineral strategies, because they finally understand what China understood a decade ago. The future runs on copper. Whoever controls the copper shapes the future. And on a frozen mountain in the Peruvian Andes, at 4,000 meters above sea level, in conditions that broke every team that came before, China made sure it would be in that conversation. The Hell mine isn't hell anymore. It turned out to be exactly what China said it was all along: the most important investment of the century. If this story shifted the way you see global resource competition, the real contest happening right now, not in headlines, but in mountain passes and deep tunnels on the other side of the world, then share it with someone who needs to understand what's actually at stake. The decisions being made today about copper, lithium, and critical minerals will shape the world for the next 50 years, and most people have no idea it's even happening. Now you do. Stay sharp, stay curious, and if you want more stories like this one, the ones behind the ones you're hearing, hit subscribe, because we're just getting started. See you in the next one.